Hello everybody. In this video I'm going to attempt to explain the infamous problem of induction, which was brought to the attention by the philosophical community by the Scottish philosopher David Hume. In order to get into this problem, we first need to define several concepts. First, there's this distinction between a priori and a posteriori. Roughly speaking, we say that a belief is justified a priori if it is justified without the use of sense experience, if it is justified by reason alone. A belief is justified a posteriori if it is justified on the basis of sense experience. With these two definitions, we can now define two groups of philosophers. On the one hand, there's a group of philosophers known as rationalists. These are the philosophers who think that we can attain a significant portion of knowledge by a priori means. We can learn about the world just by consulting our reason. Empiricists, on the other hand, think that all of the significant knowledge that we attain is justified a posteriori. They think that if we're going to learn about the world, we must learn about it using our sense experience. Next, let's remind ourselves about the difference between deduction and induction. A deductive argument attempts to establish its conclusion on the basis of logic. If a deductive argument is successful, then its conclusion will follow logically from the premises. An inductive argument, on the other hand, only attempts to make its conclusion probable. If an inductive argument is successful, then its conclusion is rendered probable by the truth of the premises. Here is a very standard example of an inductive argument. Imagine that throughout my life I've seen many ravens, and suppose that every raven that I've ever seen has been black. I can then run the following inductive argument. Premise 1, raven number 1 I've observed is black. Premise 2, raven number 2 that I've observed is black. Raven number 3 that I've observed is black, and so on, up until we get to raven number n that I've observed is black. In fact, here's a photo of a raven that I've observed. I took this photo on the Icefield Parkway between Banff and Jasper in Alberta. So I conclude, after all of these observations, that all ravens are black. This is a fairly standard example of an inductive argument. We observe a common trait between all the instances that we've observed of a certain kind, and then we inductively generalize. We conclude that all members of the kind have that trait. It's not a deductive argument because our conclusion might be wrong, but if we're lucky, then the premises we gather from observation will at least make the conclusion more likely. Now, one thing that Hume noticed that I want to bring your attention to is that unlike deductive arguments, inductive arguments have to make certain assumptions about the world being uniform in the relevant respect. When we give a deductive argument, if our argument is valid, then as long as the premises are true, then the logic will do its thing and guarantee that the conclusion's true. We don't have to make any further assumptions about the world. It all works just as a matter of logic. But when we give an inductive argument, say for the conclusion that all ravens are black, we have to assume that the class of ravens form a relatively uniform kind of thing. We have to assume that the ravens are all unified by having a common explanation for their color. In this case, we know that it's their common DNA that encodes for the color of their feathers. But the point is, our inductive argument will only work if our assumption that the ravens are relatively uniform is true. If the ravens belong to a common unified kind, then our inductive argument may be a good one. But if, on the other hand, the various organisms that we call ravens don't really have any underlying biological unity, and there's no common reason for why all the ones that I've observed as black is just random, then our inductive argument won't be any good. So now going back to the problem of induction, we can credit Hume for noticing that all inductive arguments make assumptions like this about the world being uniform in the relevant respects, relevant for the argument. The inductive arguments make assumptions about the thing that they're making an argument about having common underlying uniformities. Hume then challenges us. How do we justify these further assumptions? Hume argues that this is a problem because a problem will arise if we try to justify these further assumptions. To see what this problem is, consider this example of an inductive argument that comes from Bertrand Russell. Premise 1. The sun has risen every day until now. And then there's a hidden assumption. And then we conclude by induction that the sun will rise tomorrow. Now, what is the hidden assumption that this inductive argument is making? Russell suggests that the assumption is that the future will resemble the past. But this now raises a question. How do we justify this assumption? How do we justify our assumption that the future will resemble the past? We could try to justify it by using another inductive argument. In that case, our inductive argument will look like this. Premise 1. In the past futures have always resembled their pasts. And then we make some hidden assumption. And then we conclude by induction, therefore, in the future will resemble the past. But this inductive argument also has a hidden assumption. In fact, it assumes the very thing we're trying to justify. It assumes that the future will resemble the past. So we cannot justify the initial hidden assumption by using this inductive argument. Hume sees in this predicament a huge problem for inductive arguments in general. They all make use of hidden assumptions of uniformity. But when it comes to justifying those hidden assumptions, they cannot do so unless they use circular arguments. In fact, the problem is more general than the last argument might lead you to believe. That is because we use induction not only to predict the future, we also use it to make any sort of prediction that goes beyond our immediate sense experience. Here's the problem in its full generality. According to Hume, every inductive argument assumes what he calls the principle of the uniformity of nature. This is the assumption that our universe is governed by laws of nature. Everything that happens is explained by some fundamental law. As a result, we assume that unobserved things, unobserved causes and effects, will resemble observed things, observed causes and effects. Hume then wants to inquire as to how we could possibly justify this assumption. After all, it seems that it's possible for us to live in a world that isn't governed by laws, where everything just happens randomly. So we might wonder, how can we know that our universe is a law-governed one? Hume then goes on to argue that we cannot possibly justify this assumption. If we were to try, then we would end up assuming the very thing we were trying to justify. And so he ends up with the very skeptical conclusion that induction is never justified. Here's Hume's argument in full detail. Premise 1. All inductive arguments presuppose the principle of the uniformity of nature. That's that principle that I just talked about. Premise 2. In order to justify the conclusion of an inductive argument, one must first justify the principle of the uniformity of nature. Premise 3. Hume claims that there's only two ways to justify the principle of the uniformity of nature. We could either, 1, use a demonstrative proof, a deductive argument with a priori premises, or 2, we could use a probabilistic argument, an inductive argument with a posteriori premises. Why are these the only two options, you might ask? Well, the explanation for this has to do with the fact that Hume is an empiricist. I'm not going to go quite into Hume's empiricism, But that is how he justifies this premise. Moving on. Premise 4. Hume says that we cannot justify the principle according to one, we can't use a demonstrative argument. And the reason for this is because if we could demonstrate the uniformity of nature, then it must be a contradiction if we were to suppose that it's false. But we can imagine that the universe isn't governed by laws. It's possible that the universe is random, that it's not governed by laws. And if it's possible, then that shows that we can't demonstrate otherwise. This again, this move that Hume is making is explained by his empiricism. Okay, so moving on, in premise 5, Hume says that we also cannot justify the principle according to the second option. We can't give a probabilistic argument. Why? Because probabilistic arguments use induction, and then we would be using induction to try to justify induction. We'd be reasoning in a circle. So from that dilemma, he concludes that the principle of the uniformity of nature cannot be justified, and so he concludes that inductive arguments are never justified. Okay, so that's Hume's argument. The conclusion of it is very skeptical. He thinks that we cannot even be justified to believe something on the basis of induction. That's a very strong claim. I'm not going to really go into the details of how to respond to Hume, but suffice to say that there's been many attempts to respond to Hume throughout the history of philosophy. Philosophers have historically found this challenge to be a significant one that needs to be faced. That's all I'll say about that. If you wanted to know how to respond to this argument, you'd have to read more philosophy and take more philosophy. See you.